Dorit Kemsley spent nearly a decade as one of the most recognizable faces on Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. The fashion, the accent, the enormous Encino mansion, the marriage that always seemed to hold together, even when the cracks were visible on camera. Then, in April of 2025, she filed for divorce from P.K. Kemsley after 10 years together. And what has come out since, through court documents, her own memoir, and a string of candid interviews, paints a picture far more complicated than anything the show ever managed to capture. But to understand how it ended, you first have to understand what it actually was. Dorit and Paul Kemsley, known to everyone as PK, married in 2015 after a swift courtship. PK was a British music and sports manager, charming and camera-comfortable in a way that suggested a lifetime spent around entertaining people. Dorit was a fashion entrepreneur with a personal style so specific it became its own storyline every season. On paper, they looked like a natural fit for the world they were entering. And for a while, they looked that way on screen too. But here's the thing. The version that aired on Bravo and the version that existed in real life were never entirely the same thing. And that distance between the two is where most of this story lives. Dorit joined the show in Season 7, arriving into an already established cast with its own power structures and loyalties. She found her footing, then did more than survive. She became one of the most talked-about cast members in the show's history. PK appeared regularly alongside her, present at events, involved in storylines, clearly comfortable with the cameras. But something was shifting beneath the surface. When one half of a couple becomes significantly more famous than the other in a short period of time, the balance changes. The roles start to feel different. What once looked like a partnership begins to feel less symmetrical. Dorit has since acknowledged that people around her began pointing this out, and that once she started seeing it, she couldn't stop. But that wasn't even the most pressing thing hidden from the cameras. The financial picture behind the lifestyle they projected was far more strained than anyone watching would have guessed. The Kemsley home in Encino was nearly 9,000 square feet, 6 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, the kind of property that doesn't just cost money to buy but costs serious money to keep. What wasn't visible on screen were the 2 mortgages totaling $6 million, the payments that at various points weren't being made, and the foreclosure proceedings that Dorit would later describe as embarrassing and painful to discuss. The show caught conflict and emotion, but it never caught the growing gap between the image being projected and the reality underneath it. And then something happened that changed everything. Something that had nothing to do with money, fame, or any of the explanations most observers would later reach for. In October of 2019, while PK was away in the United Kingdom, 3 men broke into the Encino home. Dorit was there with her 2 children. The intruders restrained her at gunpoint, threatened her life in front of her kids, and spent roughly 20 minutes in the house before leaving with jewelry and other valuables. The children were not physically harmed. Dorit was not physically harmed. But what came after? That's a different story entirely. The PTSD was documented on the show. The therapy, the anxiety, the specific ways the experience had rewired how she moved through situations that had never previously felt dangerous. She was candid about it in a way that's rare for a reality television cast member, who has to balance genuine vulnerability with the knowledge that everything said on camera becomes material for an audience seeking entertainment. But what was also captured on camera was PK's response. His position was that he understood the anxiety, but viewed some of what she described as disproportionate. He used the word obnoxious in reference to certain elements of what she was experiencing. It landed badly, on screen and off, and it opened something between them that never fully closed. Dorit has described the 2.5 years following the home invasion as a period of surviving rather than living. She's been specific about the role PK's absence played, not always physical absence, though there was some of that, but emotional absence. The sense that at the moment she most needed her husband to be where she was, he was somewhere else entirely and didn't seem to want to close the distance. She called it death by 1,000 paper cuts, and she used that phrase more than once because it was genuinely accurate.
No affair.
No single catastrophic betrayal. Just the slow accumulation of distance, unmet needs, and 2 people gradually living more separate lives until the separation stopped being temporary and became the actual shape of the relationship. If the emotional unraveling was slow and complicated, the financial fallout from a divorce was anything but. PK filed court documents in spring of 2025 containing a number of specific and pointed claims. The headline figure was $1 million. His allegation that Dorit spent approximately that amount each year on luxury clothing and personal items, while mortgage payments on the Encino property went unmade. The allegations grew more specific from there. He claimed Dorit had used one of their children to pressure him for money, 2 payments of $50,000 for a spring break vacation, and that she had threatened to damage his reputation and interfere with his relationship with his girlfriend if he refused. He alleged she had known about the foreclosure situation all along, contrary to what she had suggested publicly, and that he had warned her repeatedly about the financial position they were in. Dorit pushed back directly. Her position was that the money she spent was money she had earned, from the show, from brand partnerships, from her own work, and that her spending on fashion was a professional investment for someone whose public image is literally what she is paid to maintain. She also said she had wanted to sell the house for some time, but that the inability to have productive conversations with PK had made any practical decision impossible. And that detail, both of them describing a relationship so broken they couldn't agree on anything, not even what to do about a house bleeding equity and approaching foreclosure, that might be the most revealing detail of all. The house sat between them, legally stuck, unresolved, impossible to move. And what happened next? Dorit decided to put on the record herself. She wrote a memoir. That choice alone says something. Reality television cast members write books when they are trying to process something publicly, and Dorit's memoir is clearly that, an attempt to take ownership of a narrative that was otherwise being shaped by everyone else. She framed it as a story about becoming herself, about figuring out who she was outside the marriage, the show, and the public identity built around both. What she disclosed was specific enough to be credible and restrained enough to suggest someone aware that her words would have consequences. She talked about PK's drinking, not as a dramatic revelation but as a practical fact about the marriage that had made certain periods harder than they might otherwise have been. She talked about codependency, about the way they had been almost entirely enmeshed in the early years, closeness that had felt like strength but made it harder to function independently when independence became necessary. She talked about her star rising on the show and what that did to the dynamic between them. She was careful about how she framed it. She didn't say PK couldn't handle her success, but the implication was there, confirmed by her acknowledgement that once people around her started naming the dynamic, she couldn't stop seeing it. That kind of retroactive recognition, understanding something about a relationship only after someone else names it, says a great deal about how completely she had been inside it. She was clearest of all about the home invasion as a turning point. She needed PK to show up in a specific way. He didn't. The gap that opened in that period never fully closed. What followed was gradual, increasingly parallel lives, reduced communication, distance that stopped being temporary and became permanent. Not a single moment. A process. And yet, in the middle of all of it, she said something that stopped people in their tracks. She said she didn't regret the marriage. That she would do it again the same way. That the version of herself who walked into it had not been wrong to believe it would last. That's a specific and unusual thing to say in the middle of a contentious public divorce, and it suggests someone genuinely trying to account for what happened, not simply constructing a version of events designed to make her look like the winner. The Dorit Kemsley who has shown up in public since the filing is noticeably different from the version that appeared on screen during those difficult later seasons. The tension that was visible around her has eased. People who have followed her closely note it. She looks like someone who has exhaled. She is 49 years old, with 2 children, a career built largely on her own terms, and a memoir that puts her account of the last several years on the record in her own words. The financial situation remains unresolved. The house has not been sold. The legal disputes are working their way through a process that moves on its own timeline. 2 people who built something very large together, now navigating how to dismantle it, which is the unglamorous reality underneath every high-profile divorce, regardless of how much of it ends up on television. What she has said, in the clearest terms she's used throughout all of this, is that there was a period of roughly 2.5 years during which she was not living her life but surviving it, and that the version of herself on the other side of that period is someone she recognizes more clearly and trusts more completely than the version who was inside it. That's not a tidy ending. But here's what is. Dorit Kemsley spent a decade letting cameras into her home, her arguments, and her life, and still managed to keep the most important parts of what was happening almost entirely private, until the marriage was already over. Which raises a question worth sitting with long after this story ends. If the version of a life that gets filmed and broadcast can be that different from the version actually being lived, what does that say about everything else we think we understand about the people we watch every week?